So I was like telling my mom about how after World War II, all these like German scientists came to America and they were just like sort of allowed to live their lives as normal as scientists. And like everyone just pretended they weren't Nazis. And then she was like, "Oh, so you're some kind of conspiracy theorist?" And I was like, "No, Operation Paperclip. It's a real thing. Look it up."
So you're a conspiracy theorist? The problem is that when you know stuff that most other people don't know, then they're going to kind of label you a conspiracy theorist. They're going to think that what you're saying is a conspiracy. Sometimes what you're saying is a conspiracy, but sometimes it's not. And a lot of times it's just ideas that are outside of the norm, just outside of what most people use to understand reality. Like ideas that are outside of that sort of narrative, they're usually labeled as conspiracy theories, even if they're not. It's just the idea that, most people have a very limited surface understanding of reality. And so if you bring up ideas that are sort of outside of that, they're going to have problems with that and they're going to disagree. And an easy way to sort of rectify that disagreement for them is to just label you as a conspiracy theorist. The world is like more complex now than ever before, and because of the internet, we kind of realize that, we see it a little bit. But most people's understanding of what's going on, most people's understanding of reality is based on what they hear on the media. So either on the news, on the TV, on social media, or on like YouTube, just like all these other places where like sort of the mainstream narratives are pushed. That's kind of what most people understand about reality. That's their kind of understanding of things, and that's always very surface. It's always without nuance, and it's always without depth. Not always, but for the most part. And, just the kind of the key here is that like most people's opinions about the world are framed by the media, are framed by the mainstream media and the ideas that come from there. And so there are opinions, or there are sort of other people's views of sort of mainstream stories, but those are all still like falling within line, right? Those are all fitting within the Overton window for the most part. Like not everything, obviously. There's always fringe people who have fringe ideas, and you can find them on the internet if you're willing to look for them. But for the most part, most people fall within the ideas that fit into the Overton window, even if there's like this appearance of a diversity of thought. And because of this sort of narrow and limited view of reality, a lot of ideas, like totally legitimate scientific ideas that it can be proven by fact, they fall outside of most people's sort of limited, narrow version of reality. Sometimes they can't make sense of them, sometimes it doesn't fit into their worldview, and sometimes it just is incomprehensible to them. And so there's lots of ideas that fall outside of the Overton window, that fall outside of most people's understanding of reality. They can be totally legitimate facts, but just because most people don't realize it, because most people don't understand it, then they will kind of label those ideas as fringe conspiracy theories. But the thing is that anytime you dig, like you always will understand things a little bit more deeply. And there's this like old story about the scientist who reads this article about his field, and he realizes that, whoa, this story is inaccurate, this is misrepresenting the facts. But then he flips the page and he reads the next article and then pretends that what just happened didn't happen. And so the thing is like if you understand a topic, if you understand depth and you understand the nuance of the arguments, then you're going to realize that, most sort of mainstream representations of those events are inaccurate. And that's mostly for simplicity's sake. That's mostly for like economics, and that it's easier to create a general article as opposed to an in-depth article. And it's better if people just get a really simple understanding than a complex one, because if it's complex, then they might get bored, they might stop reading, or, even they just won't believe what you want them to believe. And like for the most part, the media has to simplify. It has to make stories easier for people to understand, because most people don't have the depth of knowledge to understand complex ideas. They also don't have the depth of knowledge to make sense of a complicated story. And also too, like to a certain extent, if you give people both sides of an argument, then you kind of give them an opportunity to choose their opinion. And while that is good for a person themselves, it's bad because it's bad for the producer of that content, because that person is telling their story because they want to influence your thoughts. They want to make you think about reality in a certain way that's either beneficial to them and their product, but also beneficial to their advertisers. And so there's always like an incentive not to give you a full sort of rounded view of things, because there's the risk that you understand it better than you're supposed to. Like an example, like a good example of this is like money. Like most people think that money comes from like hard work. It's like you go to your job every day, you do your job, you earn money, and at the end of the day you get a paycheck, and you get money out of it. And you're like, well, money must be created like that way, right? Like you just assume that from your experience you have to do something, you have to do hard work, you have to earn your money, and that you get paid for it. So there's this like underlying assumption that money just comes out of doing something, out of creating value. But like the reality is, like, most money is created by lending, and so central banks lend to commercial banks, and commercial banks give people mortgages and credit card loans and debt, and like that's how money gets created, right? Like this money comes out of thin air that didn't exist before, and then that's how money gets created. And so like there's this weird disconnect. Like most people probably wouldn't realize that that's how money gets created. And there's obviously more detail to this. There's more intricacy. There's more nuance. But like the simple idea is that most money is created out of debt. Most money is created out of lending. The other day, my daughter had this box of jelly beans, and in there was vanilla. And I pointed out, artificial vanilla flavor comes from beaver butts. And like everyone at the table just looked at me like I was crazy. They were like, well, they obviously thought that wasn't true, but like it is true, like if you look up artificial vanilla flavor, it comes from beaver butts. And it's even labeled as like a natural or artificial flavor because it comes from a natural place, right? Like it's not made with chemicals. It comes from a beaver's butt. And part of the reason why that exists is because real vanilla is really expensive. And so it's not really practical to use like en masse, but that's why there's an alternative. But the thing is that most people have no idea that that's a thing. And so that kind of could sound like a conspiracy theory to them until you show them the evidence to prove it. My point of these stories and these examples is that like there's so many strange and unknown facts. There's so many like different explanations. There's so many details. There's so many like connections between things that like most people don't know because it doesn't come up. Like it's not something that we usually talk about. Like we don't usually talk about how money is made. We don't usually talk about artificial vanilla flavor. But like these things exist in the world and there's tons of them. And like most people don't know about them because they have a very surface sort of without depth understanding of reality in the world around them. And so they don't realize that there's these other sort of unknown factors that come in that contribute to most things. And the thing is like when you know about this stuff, when you know about these real life connections that are that are verifiable by science or by facts, like most people are going to question the validity, even if what you're saying is totally legitimate and valid. Like I remember once telling this doctor about this article that I had read in a scientific journal, and then when I told him about it, he was like, "Oh, that doesn't make sense." But like it was from a scientific journal, and so maybe it doesn't make sense to him because he hadn't read it, but like the whole thing is like you can like talk about like totally legitimate stuff. And like, even like scientists and doctors might not have consumed it because like, a doctor and scientist and, they're just regular people like everyone else. Like they might have a different job. They might have like a high qualifications, but they're just like everyone else. At the same time, like because of the world that we are living in these days and all the strange things that have been happening, the idea of the conspiracy theorist has been weaponized. And what I mean by that is that a lot of ideas, like totally legitimate ideas, ideas that haven't been investigated thoroughly, they often get labeled as conspiracy theories. And like this is beneficial because like in some ways it prevents people from thinking about them, from investigating, from digging in, because when you hear something is labeled a conspiracy theory, then you kind of get to turn off your thinking about it. You don't have to investigate it. And so, like, part of it is, like, this is a legitimate way of discrediting legitimate ideas. But, like, the other reality or the other side of things is that there are, like, a lot of conspiracy theories that are not true. And I would say that most conspiracy theories, like, if you hear about a conspiracy theory on the news, like, if you hear it on the mainstream media, it's probably not a real conspiracy. There are, like, real conspiracies, but they're probably not the ones that you hear about all the time. They're, like, more fringe. Like, the real conspiracies, there's lots of conspiracies, and to find, like, the real conspiracies is a skill, and it's difficult to find. But like sort of the idea here though is that anytime you question like the mainstream narrative, it's labeled as a conspiracy theory. And the truth of the matter is that it's not necessarily a conspiracy theory. Sometimes it's like a totally legitimate explanation for what's happening, but because it's outside of the narrative, it's because it's outside of most people's understanding, then it sounds like a conspiracy theory, and it can be kind of labeled a conspiracy theory so that there's no further investigation on it, so that the idea is discredited before it's even actually investigated or tested. And like it's kind of like a thing that happens, unfortunately. But the whole thing is like if you're like a critical thinker, if you're open-minded, then you're going to be exposed to a lot of ideas that most regular people don't know about. And so they're going to just assume that when you talk about these things that you're a conspiracy theorist, because sometimes like totally legitimate ideas are too far outside of like the Overton window of what most normal people have accepted. And so ideas, like legitimate ideas, can sound like fringe ideas. They can sound like conspiracy theories. And it's really easy to label something as a conspiracy theory, because then that, automatically turns off the need to think about it. You can just discredit it. You can pretend that it doesn't exist. You can pretend that there's some other, explanation, one that fits more into the worldview that's been perpetuated by the media and the mainstream. I would say that the main goal of labeling people as a conspiracy theorist is a way to discourage critical thought. It's a way to discourage questioning narratives, and it's a way to discourage depth. It's a way to just get people to accept sort of the narratives that are around and not to kind of investigate them on their own. And for most people, this is fine because most people don't really care about depth. They don't really care about understanding. They want to just like kind of accept what is and go along with it because that makes life easier. And, for the most part, that's probably true. And like, if you're like a critical thinker, if you're open-minded, you're used to being an outcast a little bit. You're used to being treated as someone who's like a little bit like crazy or someone who just doesn't questions things too much. But that's okay, because part of like being a smart person, or part of being understanding reality, is like having the openness to actually investigate ideas that most people won't accept and won't understand. And the problem is, or the difficulty is that for most people, like that nuance, like to realize the difference between what's obviously fake and what's obviously true is a lot more complicated than necessary. And so let me know what you think in the comments below. Click that like button if you enjoyed this. And if you are curious about learning how to think and you don't want to be told what to think, then click that subscribe button. You've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you next time. Goodbye.